I okay.
Nice. Yeah.
So let me welcome you to the last presentation of 2025, which uh, moved over a little bit for various reasons. Uh, we are very happy today to have as our speaker Whitney Schwab, who is a professor at Fordham University in New York. I have known Whitney for many years now. And although I was not one of his official advisors, he and I spent many, many wonderful hours talking about understanding and episteme and the Republic. I remember them very fondly and actually more than fondly because I actually learned a lot from them. Whitney has started working mostly on Plato, with one exception, the paper on Hellenistic philosophy. Recently, he's been working more on the Hellenistic schools, and he's actually written on Pyrrhonians, on Stoics, and on Epicureans, which is quite an accomplishment altogether. And today, he's giving us a paper with a very intriguing title, Knowledge as a Form in the Republic. Thanassis and I were both wondering before what exactly we're going to hear. So, Whitney, the floor is yours. We're looking forward to hearing you, and thank you all for coming here today.
Good. Yeah. So thanks everyone for attending and for your flexibility. It's a real honor and humbling experience to be part of this because so many of the people that I'm looking at have played such a pivotal role in me being where I am. Amber Carpenter was my undergraduate thesis advisor, and Ben Morrison, who I met junior year abroad, has been just such a great influence. Gail Fine, even though I didn't take a single class with her in undergrad, even though I was at Cornell and got interested in ancient philosophy right away, it just didn't work out. Has been a great help in the time after that. And Alexander, I actually intended to write my dissertation on Aristotle's distinction between doxa and episteme. And so for my general's exam, I did the Platonic background. And over many conversations at the end, Alexander was just like, just write that. Just that's what you should do. Just write that down. So I did. And so I've actually never really has come back to Aristotle as much explicitly as I originally had intended to. And I do want to also echo the appreciation that Jessica gave in her email for all the work that Alexander and Thanassis and Xanthippe put into this colloquium. It's been really great. I've learned a lot, and I don't think I'm unique in that experience. So it's also maybe fitting that this talk is last, given that the issue that we're contributing to is from the original email devoted to Plato's metaphysics, methodology, epistemology, and their political implications in books 5 to 7 of the Republic. Because I'm going to be talking about the metaphysics, methodology, and epistemology, and I'm at least going to say the word political a few times. Okay, so as everyone knows, deep into Book 5 of Plato's Republic, Glaucon insists that Socrates finally address whether it is possible for this constitution to come into existence and how it could ever do so. Socrates insists in return that Glaucon not compel him to show it as coming about indeed, exactly as we recounted it in speech, because, as he has just claimed, it is not possible for something to be carried out exactly as described in speech. So, granted that concession by Glaucon, Socrates maintains, quite infamously, that the best way a city that is closest to what we've described can be founded is for political power and philosophy to become thoroughly blended together. Indeed, Socrates goes so far as to claim that until philosophers rule as kings in their cities, cities will have no rest from evils, my dear Glaucon, nor, I think, will the human race. So that claim was no less controversial in Plato's time than it is in ours. I can just imagine, at least in the American context, what would happen if someone on the floor of Congress proposed this. And Glaucon warned Socrates that if people were to hear it, they would attack him mercilessly. Given that warning, Socrates spends considerable time defending it. He argues that philosophers are best suited to rule because only philosophers make a certain cognitive achievement for which his preferred term seems to be episteme, and he thinks that episteme is necessary for good ruling. Then, over the course of books 5 to 7, Socrates articulates a conception of episteme on which it is an incredibly demanding cognitive achievement. Indeed, citizens of Callipolis achieve episteme only after undergoing its entire educational program, culminating sometime after the age of 50 in grasping the form of the good, which is the principle of everything, and in some way the explanation of all things. So in this talk, I argue that Socrates in the Republic countenances a form of episteme. That is, just as he countenances a form of justice, a form of beauty, a form of the good, and so on, he countenances a form of episteme. Thus, we should take his discussion of episteme in books 5 to 7 to be theoretically parallel to his discussion of, for example, justice in books 2 to 4. So just as he tells us that his discussion of justice aimed to produce a paradigm, a paradeigma, that can then be put to various theoretical uses, we should take his discussion of episteme to aim to produce a paradigm that can be put to various theoretical uses. And just as Socrates thinks that actual concrete people are not unqualifiedly just, but rather participate in the form of justice, and both are and are not just, he thinks that actual thinkers are not unqualifiedly epistemon, but rather participate in the form of episteme, and both are and are not epistemon. So I contend that once we recognize that Socrates' countenance is a form of episteme, we can better understand his overall epistemology. On my reading, Socrates' approach to episteme is in line with what Amber Carpenter has labeled paradigmatist epistemology and Robert Pasnow has labeled idealized epistemology. Such an approach takes the task of determining what episteme is to be the task of determining the paradigm of episteme. That is, what unqualified or ideal episteme is. Cognitive events are then evaluated as successes or failures, depending on how they approximate that ideal. And I contend that understanding Socrates' epistemology in this way allows us to make sense of potential oddities of his discussion, such as attributing episteme to people who we cannot think have grasped the form of the good. So I'll spend the first part of this talk arguing that Socrates does countenance a form of episteme, and the second part exploring some of the consequences this has for our interpretation of his epistemology. The latter half will be especially programmatic, and I would love to hear whether people think the consequences I explore are worth exploring, and whether there are other consequences that might be more deserving of attention. Of course, if I'm wrong that he counts as a form of episteme, or even if I'm right, there aren't interesting consequences, that would be disappointing, but worth hearing for sure. Okay, so the first main part, arguing that Socrates' countenance is a form of episteme. So this is what's part 2 on the handout. So I admit up front that unlike characters in other dialogues, Socrates in the Republic nowhere explicitly says there is a form of episteme, as he does, for example, with the form of the good. Nor does he do anything effectively equivalent in connection with episteme, such as using his itself locution with its form signaling force, as he does, for example, with justice itself, the good itself, and the beautiful itself. So, of course, a serious question I must answer is, if Socrates counts as a form of episteme, why don't we find such locutions in the dialogue? Okay, so the first thing to note is that the absence of such explicit locutions is not conclusive evidence against thinking that Socrates countenances a form of episteme. Such locutions are actually rare in the Republic generally. And insofar as Socrates indicates his philosophical motivations for countenancing forms, those motivations generate a broader range of forms than we find occurring in such explicit locutions. Of course, what range of forms Plato countenanced, and related what philosophical motivations led Plato to posit forms, are among the most discussed issues in the literature on Platonic metaphysics. And I do not intend a novel contribution to this debate, and I focus only on Socrates in the Republic. For my purposes, what matters is that, at least I think, all interpreters agree that at least one of Socrates' philosophical motivations for positing forms is the phenomenon known as the compresence of opposites. Since I don't intend a novel contribution to the debate of that phenomenon, I rest content with a general characterization of it. And Verity Hart helpfully offers one, and this is text 1 on your handout. At its most general, the compresence of opposites is a situation in which it would be true to say of some subject both that it is F and that it is un-F, the opposite of F. That is, for example, both beautiful and ugly. So the most relevant passages in which Socrates addresses the compresence of opposites are in the discussion at the end of Book 5 and the Summoner's passage in Book 7. And I'm going to focus only on Book 5. What I want to do is go through those passages and argue that, Insofar as we can make sense of why Socrates thought that the common presence of opposites occurs with beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, and so on, we should think that it occurs with episteme and its opposite, ignorance. So as Socrates puts it, the overarching aim of the Book 5 argument is to define for them, those people who would attack Socrates mercilessly, define for them who the philosophers are that we dare to say should rule. The immediate context of the first passage I consider is Glaucon's claim that if Socrates is right that the philosopher is someone who turns gladly to learning and is insatiable for it, then many strange people will be philosophers. Quite famously, Glaucon gives as examples the lovers of sights, the lovers of sounds, and students of similar things or of petty crafts. Socrates responds that such people are like philosophers, and that philosophers are lovers of seeing the truth. When Glaucon responds, that too is no doubt correct, but what exactly do you mean by it? Socrates explains what he means. And this is T2 on your handout. It would not be easy to explain to someone else, but you, I imagine, will agree to the following: that since beautiful is the opposite of ugly, they are two things. And since they are two things, each of them is also one. And the same account applies then to just and unjust, good and bad, and all the forms. Each of them is itself one thing, but because they appear all over the place in partnership with actions and bodies and with one another, each of them appears to be many things. So the first sentence of T2 seems to signal that Socrates thinks Glaucon will agree with what he's about to say because Glaucon already countenances forms. Now, to be sure, Socrates does not mention episteme here, but he does say the same account, the same logos, applies to all the forms. And the account does apply to episteme. Episteme has an opposite, ignorance, and since episteme and ignorance are two things, each of them is one. Episteme and ignorance also appear all over the place in partnership with actions and bodies. This person appears epistemon, that person appears epistemon, this person appears ignorant, that person appears ignorant, this action appears epistemon, that action appears ignorant, and so on. Then later, when they're identifying the natural objects of doxa, namely those things that both are and are not, the issue of the common presence of opposites comes front and center. Socrates imagines asking the following questions of that lover of seeing who cannot bear to hear anyone say that the beautiful is one thing or the just or any of the rest. So this is T3 on your handout. Socrates is imagining asking that person, of all the many beautiful things, is there one that won't also appear ugly, or any just one that won't appear unjust, or any pious one that won't appear impious? Glaucon, there is not. On the contrary, it is inevitable that they would somehow appear both beautiful and ugly. And the same with the other things you asked about. They then extend this to doubles and halves, and big, small, light, and heavy. And then Socrates concludes this little bit. Then is each of the many things any more what one says it is than it is not what one says it is? So, of course, interpreters debate exactly how to understand Socrates and Glaucon here. Right? We've seen some of that in this series. They debate whether the many beautiful things are supposed to be perceptible particulars or perceptible universals, or other terminology getting at that rough distinction. They also debate why Socrates thinks it is permissible to move from claims involving the verb to appear, phanestai, in the first part, to a claim involving the verb to be, anai, in the last part. And of course, one of the most debated issues in the literature is how to understand the verb to be in the Book 5 argument as a whole. But I submit that on any plausible interpretation, what Socrates and Glaucon say applies to episteme and ignorance. If the many F's are supposed to be perceptible particulars, I think we can say something like the following. One and the same person who appears epistemon, say, relative to some contrast class or with respect to some subject matter, farming, will appear ignorant, say, relative to a different contrast class or with respect to a different subject matter, say, metalworking. This mirrors the way in which many interpreters take Socrates' point to be that one and the same person, Helen, for example, will appear beautiful relative to other earthly women and ugly relative to Aphrodite. Now, if the many F's are supposed to be perceptible universals, one and the same universal, for example, proving the Pythagorean theorem from geometrical principles, has instances that are epistemo, if accompanied, say, by the ability to take up those geometrical principles to the form of the good, and instances that are ignorant. For example, if they're not accompanied by such an ability. So this last example is, of course, developed from books 6 and 7, which I'm going to turn to later. This mirrors the way in which some interpreters take Socrates' point to be that one and the same universal, for example, returning what one owes, has instances that are unjust, for example, if accompanied by the madness of the one to whom something is owed, and instances that are just, for example, if accompanied by the sanity of the one to whom something is owed. So in short, I submit that if sense can be made of Socrates' concerns surrounding the common presence of opposites when it comes to beauty and ugliness, justice and injustice, and so on, we should take the same concerns to apply to episteme and ignorance. And I, at least, see no reason to think that there is something special about episteme and ignorance that would lead Socrates to think it isn't necessary to posit a form of episteme. So following on from this last point, I want to consider a passage from the image of the sun, which we will examine in more detail below. So Socrates begins his presentation of that image by reminding his interlocutors of something we have already said here as well as on many other occasions, namely, that there are many beautiful, many good, and many other such things. These are, of course, the things we have just seen suffer the common presence of opposites. Socrates then continues, and this is T4 on your handout, we also say there is a beautiful itself and a good itself. And so in the case of all the things that we then posited as many, we reverse ourselves and posit a single form belonging to each, since we suppose there is a single one, and call each what it is, fasten. And we say that the one class of things is visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible. So Socrates says that on many occasions they have called the form of X what X is. That is, the form of X is what you are referring to and indeed defining when you answer the question, what is X? And I think that Socrates certainly takes himself to re-answering the question, what is episteme, in books 5 to 7. We will consider his answer to that question later, but I again see every reason to think that he takes what episteme is to exhibit all the characteristics he attributes to forms. It is intelligible, unchanging, not in any way ignorant, and so on. Okay, so it may be objected that even if what I've said so far is correct, all it perhaps shows is that Socrates should have countenanced or was committed to countenancing a form of episteme. It might not show that he did countenance a form of episteme or recognize that he was committed to doing so. In a sense, the problem I noted in the introduction to this section becomes pressing. Why didn't he say so? Now, I confess that I don't see why there should be a special problem in the case of episteme. Interpreters agree that Socrates countenances forms corresponding to the predicates in T3, even if he does not explicitly say so elsewhere. Of course, episteme does not appear in T3. But interpreters also think that the common presence of opposites applies to more examples than Socrates explicitly offers in T3. And later I'm going to suggest that the specific argumentative context makes episteme's absence in T3 understandable, even if I'm right that he thinks the common presence of opposites applies to it. But what I want to argue now is that there is more evidence that Socrates, at least in effect, explicitly countenances a form of episteme than interpreters have recognized. So there's a section, episteme and wisdom. So I think we're on part 2 of the handout, or page 2 of the handout. Oh, sorry, no, we're already there. So I begin by looking at the connection that Socrates posits between episteme and wisdom, Sophia. I assume here, and I think all interpreters agree, that Socrates countenances forms of justice, courage, temperance, and wisdom. If that assumption is correct, I argue that we have strong reason for thinking that he countenances a form of episteme. After that, I will argue that some interpreters are tacitly committed to thinking that he does, given what they say about Socrates' conception of the relationship between wisdom and episteme. So I begin with something like an onus shifting question. On what grounds could we deny that Socrates countenances a form of episteme that wouldn't also lead us to deny that he countenances these other virtue forms? So I've already argued that at least one of the reasons why Socrates countenances these virtue forms, issues surrounding the common presence of opposites, applies to episteme. But more generally, Socrates thinks that episteme is a part of virtue. He perhaps makes this most clear when, in Book 6, he transitions from arguing that philosophers are the ones who are able to grasp what is always the same in all respects, to arguing that philosophers are better suited to lead than those who cannot grasp what is always the same in all respects, those who wander among the many things that vary in every sort of way. Socrates maintains that, at least insofar as we consider only their cognitive conditions, the difference between non-philosophers and philosophers is akin to the difference between blind and keen-sighted people. And that's because non-philosophers are deprived of the gnosis of each thing that is, and have no clear paradigm of it in their souls. And he thinks that philosophers are not so deprived. But Socrates says we must look at more than cognitive conditions to determine who ought to lead. And this is T5 in the handout. Shall we appoint these blind people as our guardians, then? Or those who have gnosis of each thing that is, have no less experience than the others, and are not inferior to them in any other part of virtue? But up to this point in Book 6, all Socrates has focused on is the philosopher's gnosis episteme, gnosis/episteme, and the non-philosopher's lack of it. The clear implicature of Socrates' claim that, to be properly appointed guardians, philosophers must not be inferior in any other part of virtue, is that gnosis/episteme is also a part of virtue. But if Socrates thinks that episteme is a part of virtue, he presumably countenances a form of episteme, since he countenances forms of the other parts of virtue. But perhaps more importantly, Socrates defines wisdom in terms of episteme. So back in Book 4, after outlining the constitution of the city, Socrates turns to its virtues and claims that the first thing I think I can see clearly in the city is wisdom. According to Socrates, the city is really wise because it is judicious. And this very thing, judiciousness, is some kind of episteme. Socrates and Glaucon then tried to identify which of the many multifarious kinds of episteme in the city makes the city wise. In the next stretch of text, they deny that the city is wise in virtue of the episteme that its carpenters, metalworkers, or farmers have. I will return to this point later, as many interpreters think that Socrates must be using episteme loosely here, where this means some version of he's not using it in line with the meaning he imbues it with in the middle books. On my interpretation, we can read Socrates as using episteme here in Book 4, in line with what he says about episteme in the middle books. But for now, what is important is how Socrates and Glaucon conclude their attempt to identify the kind of episteme that makes the city wise. And this is T6 on the handout. Glaucon says, it is the episteme of guardianship, and the ones who possess it are those rulers we just now called complete guardians. So it is because of the smallest group or part of itself, and the episteme that is in it, the part that governs and rules, that a city founded according to nature would be wise as a whole. And this class, which seems to be by nature the smallest, is the one that inherently possesses a share of the episteme that alone among all the other sorts of episteme should be called wisdom. So the guardian class possessing a share of the episteme that should be called wisdom is what makes the city wise. As the city soul analogy leads us to expect, we learn later in Book 4 that the private individual is wise in the same way and because of the same element as in the city. Socrates fleshes that out by saying, we call him wise, surely, because of the small part that rules in him, makes those pronouncements, and has within it the episteme of what is advantageous, both for each part and for the whole, the community composed of all three. Now, this account of wisdom is, as Socrates says later, an outline of wisdom, and the same holds for the accounts of the other virtues Socrates offers in Book 4. That outline is fleshed out by the discussion of the form of the good and its role in, among other things, episteme in the middle books. So this point is rightly stressed by Claudia Yao in a recent paper on Sophia and the Republic, from which I've greatly benefited. So I'm very glad that Claudia is in the audience here. Of course, interpreters disagree over exactly how Socrates conceives of the relationship between wisdom and episteme. But on one view, which Yao calls the identity reading, and that she shows is at least a popular view, wisdom is identical to episteme. Consider, for example, the following claim from John Cooper, and this is T7 on your handout. In fact, though Socrates does not make a point of saying this there in Book 4, it is actual, unqualified wisdom itself, the full human virtue, consisting in a final and complete knowledge of the whole system of the forms, and especially knowledge of that system as having at its apex the form of the good. But if Cooper is right, and wisdom just is episteme, and Socrates countenances a form of wisdom, he must countenance a form of episteme. And even if wisdom is instead a kind of episteme, we should conclude that he countenances a form of episteme. It would be odd, I think, for him to countenance a form of the subkind, that is wisdom, but not a form of the kind, that is episteme. Of course, this does not cover all the possible ways of interpreting the connection Socrates posits between wisdom and episteme. It does not cover, for example, Yao's view, on which, quoting from her paper, episteme is necessary for and partly constitutive of Sophia. And I'm unsure whether a similar argument would work for her view. But at the very least, we've seen that some interpreters who have taken a stand on Socrates' conception of wisdom and its relationship to episteme are tacitly committed to reading Socrates as countenancing a form of episteme. I now want to argue that there is a way of reading the image of the sun as involving an explicit commitment to a form of episteme. Okay, so as I noted earlier, in Book 6, Socrates says that the accounts of the virtues he developed in Book 4 were outlines that need to be completed by a discussion of the greatest subject. That greatest subject is, of course, the form of the good. Socrates presents the image of the sun most immediately in response to his interlocutor's insistence that he tell them whether he thinks the good is episteme or pleasure, or is it something else altogether. As is well known, Socrates demurs, but he offers to tell them about what seems to be an offspring of the good and most like it. As we saw earlier, when his interlocutors accept that offer, Socrates begins by reminding them that they have often distinguished many beautiful things, many good things, and so on, from the form of beauty, the form of the good, and so on. And he noted that we say that the one class of things is visible but not intelligible, while the forms are intelligible but not visible. That was T4. So as is well known, Socrates claims that the sun is the promised offspring of the good, and that what the latter is in the intelligible realm in relation to nous and intelligible things, the former is in the visible realm in relation to sight and visible things. When Socrates then fleshes out the analogy between the role of the sun in the visible realm and the role of the form of the good in the intelligible realm, he, to my mind at least, places episteme among the forms that are intelligible but not visible. So this is T8 on your handout. You must say then that what gives truth to the objects of gnosis and the power to the one with gnosis is the form of the good. And as the cause of episteme and truth, you must think of it as an object of gnosis. Both gnosis and truth are beautiful beings. They're kalon onton. But if you're to think correctly, you must think of it, that's the form of the good, as other and more beautiful than they. Just as there, light and sight are rightly thought to be sun-like, but wrongly thought to be the sun, so in this way here, it is right to think of episteme and truth as good-like, but wrong to think of either of them as the good. For the state of the good is to be vastly more honored. So this is a difficult passage and requires more discussion than I have time for here. But I want to point out the following. Socrates says that gnosis slash episteme and truth are both beautiful beings. They're both kolon onton. This is the first signal that they are among the beings, that is, among the forms that are visible but not intelligible. Socrates then reinforces this point with the following contrast. Whereas there, eke, that is on the side of the image that corresponds to things that are visible but not intelligible, light and sight are thought to be sun-like. In contrast here, in Tautha, that is on the side of the image that corresponds to things that are intelligible but not visible, episteme and truth are good-like, but not the good itself. The point, I take it, is that it would be a mistake to identify episteme or truth with the form of the good. Recall that the image is given in response to his interlocutor's demand that he say whether he thinks the good is episteme or pleasure or is it something else altogether. But the reason why he thinks it is wrong to identify episteme or truth with the form of the good is not that episteme and truth are not even the kind of things that could be mistakenly identified with the form of the good. They are, after all, both beings. Rather, it is because the form of the good is other and more beautiful than episteme and truth. But to position episteme and truth in relation to the form of the good in this way is, I think, to place episteme on the same side of the image as the form of the good. That is, among the forms that are visible, forms that are intelligible but not visible. Thus, I submit that we can read Socrates as here explicitly countenancing a form of episteme. Okay, I want to consider, so I should, I guess, say, part of my idea is if I'm right that he is sort of theoretically committed to it, that to me makes it even more promising to read the image as I've suggested. Okay. So I want to consider a further objection that I've received to my claim that Socrates' countenance is a form of episteme, namely that Socrates characterizes episteme as a power, a dunamis. Of course, he does do so, most notably in the Book 5 argument, parts of which we considered above. What I insist is that this does not present an obstacle to our thinking that he countenances a form of episteme, because he does the very same thing with courage and justice. That is, he characterizes courage and justice as powers, and he countenances a form of courage and a form of justice. And I think by implication of the two passages I'm about to consider, the same holds for temperance and wisdom. First, concerning courage, this is T8 on your handout. So courage too belongs to a city because of a part of itself, because it has in that part the power to preserve through everything its belief that the things and the sorts of things that should inspire terror are the very things and sorts of things that the lawgiver declared to be such in the course of educating it. Or don't you call that courage? Then, concerning justice, and this is T9 on your handout, after our consideration of temperance, courage, and wisdom, I think that what remains in the city is the power that makes it possible for all of these to arise in it, and that preserves them when they have arisen for as long as it remains there itself. And we did say that justice would be what remained when we had found the other three. Thus, Socrates characterizing X as a power does not entail that he does not countenance a form of X. In fact, I think that this observation might explain why Socrates does not include episteme in the passages from Book 5 that we considered above. Given that Socrates' focus there is on the power of episteme, he might have thought it would be overly confusing to include the many epistemones as an example of something that suffers the calm presence of opposites. Of course, more needs to be said to explain the relationship between episteme, characterized as a power, and the form of episteme, but the same holds for courage and justice. I have some thoughts on that, but I'm withhold from giving that now. Okay. So I think that recognizing Socrates' countenance as a form of episteme has many interesting consequences for our interpretation of his epistemology. What I want to do in the remainder of this talk is just sketch out some of those consequences. Up to this point, I have been discussing what I think should be common ground among interpreters. That is, if what I have said is correct, I think that interpreters should agree that Socrates' countenance is a form of episteme, and that's regardless of what particular views they have about Socrates' conception of forms, participants, and the relationship between them. In what follows, I will be more idiosyncratic. And although I will provide the textual basis for my claims, I will typically not defend my readings against alternatives. So my approach will be to explore what we can learn about Socrates' discussion of episteme in books 6 and 7, now that we have seen that he thinks it is theoretically parallel to his discussion of other things of which he countenances forms. And I will focus on his discussion of justice. My reason for this is that after Glaucon insists in book 5 that Socrates addressed the realizability of the city, Socrates makes some methodological points about their inquiry into justice that we now see govern his discussion of episteme. So, after Glaucon asks Socrates about the realizability of the city, Socrates tells Glaucon to first recall that it was our inquiry into the nature of justice and injustice that brought us to this point. When Glaucon understandably responds, "True, but what of it?" Socrates says the following. Oh, nothing. Sorry, this is T10 on your handout. Oh, nothing. However, if we discover the nature of justice, should we also expect the just man not to differ from justice itself in any way, but on the contrary, to have entirely the same nature it does? Or will we be satisfied if he is closest to it and partakes in it far more than anyone else? So it was for the sake of a paradigm that we were inquiring into the nature of justice itself and of the completely just man, supposing he could exist, and what he would be like if he did. And similarly with injustice and the most unjust man. We thought that by seeing how they seem to us to stand with regard to happiness and its opposite, we would also be compelled to agree about ourselves as well, that the one who is most like them would have a fate most like theirs. But we were not doing this in order to demonstrate that it is possible for these men to exist. So I want to make several observations about this passage, and these are the bullet-pointed things on the handout. First, participation in a form is not an on-off matter, but comes in degrees. That is, the question is not only whether, but to what degree something participates in a form. I take this to follow from Socrates' claim that the just man, that is, the concrete, flesh and blood person of whom it is appropriate to predicate just, is the person who is closest to the form of justice and partakes in it far more than anyone else. Now, I know that this is controversial. Some interpreters, including in the audience, deny that participation comes in degrees, and we've seen at least one passage that might tell against it. But I'm going to assume that participation comes in degrees, and I can defend that assumption more in the Q&A. Second, and following on from the previous point, it being appropriate to predicate just of a person is not a matter of them failing to differ in any way from the form of justice. Rather, it is a matter of them participating in the form of justice to a sufficient degree in a certain context. In this case, it seems relative to anyone else. Third, Socrates and Glaucon's inquiry into justice aimed to produce a paradigm, a paradeigma. That paradigm grounds the attributions and denials of the predicate just and structures their evaluation of other soul and city constitutions. Given that Socrates views his discussion of epistêmê as theoretically parallel to his discussion of justice, we can infer the following. First, participation in the form of epistêmê comes in degrees. Second, it being appropriate to predicate epistemôn of a concrete flesh and blood thinker is not a matter of them failing to differ in any way from the form of epistêmê. Rather, it is a matter of them participating in the form of epistêmê to a sufficient degree in a certain context. Third, Socrates' inquiry into epistêmê will aim to produce a paradigm, and that paradigm will ground attributions and denials of epistemôn, and it will structure their evaluation of other cognitive states. So, as I understand him, Socrates' philosophical approach to epistêmê is in line with what Amber Carpenter calls a paradeigmatist epistemology and what Robert Pasnow calls an idealized epistemology. So Amber, in the paper that I'm taking this most directly from, is focusing on the rankings of knowledge in the philebus. And part of what I'm taking myself to be doing is arguing that the approach to epistemology, she argues we should take Socrates in the philebus to have, is very much in line with the approach to epistemology that Socrates in the Republic has, that there's continuity between those dialogues. And indeed, although Pasnow focuses on Aristotle and Descartes in his 2013 paper, Epistemology Idealized, sort of a manifesto for this approach to epistemology, he suggests that one might see Plato taking this approach in the Republic. But it's in a footnote, and that's all he says about Plato. So Pasnow characterizes idealized epistemology as follows, and this is T11 on your handout. In idealized epistemology, one aspires first to describe the epistemic ideal that human beings might hope to achieve, and then second, to chart the various ways in which we commonly fall off from that ideal. In effect, I take Socrates' account of epistêmê to be his articulation of the epistemic ideal, and the divided line to be his charting of the various ways in which we commonly fall off from it. And I take the paradigm of epistêmê to stand to the other states on the line, as the paradigm of justice stands to the degenerative soul and city constitutions that he discusses in books 8 and 9. So in this approach to epistemology, once the ideal has been articulated, questions of approximation to that ideal, rather than simple yes-no questions of attainment, come to the fore. For example, when evaluating whether it is appropriate to predicate epistêmê of, say, an actual concrete thinker, the paradeigmatist does not ask whether they have met the ideal, but rather how closely they approximate to it. As a result, the appropriateness of attributing or denying the label epistêmê can be context sensitive. The same degree of approximation can be appropriately labeled epistêmê in one context and appropriately denied that label in a different context, and this occurs without equivocation on the word epistêmê. So as Amber Carpenter puts it, and this is T12 in your handout, the paradeigmatist can grant or withdraw knowledge claims flexibly, but not arbitrarily, and without equivocation on knowing. So it's helpful to contrast such paradeigmatist or idealized approaches to epistemology with what Pasnow calls threshold approaches. although I'm here generalizing what Pascal says. On a threshold approach to epistemology, on a threshold approach to episteme, one would take the articulated conditions in episteme to be the conditions one must meet for any attribution of episteme to be appropriate. That is, someone either meets the conditions, and so is epistemôn, or fails to meet them, and so is not epistemôn. This is the case even if one thinks those conditions are ideal. That is, even if one thinks that those conditions are in principle incapable of being improved upon. I hasten to add that whether one thinks that Socrates takes a paradeigmatist or a threshold approach to episteme does not necessarily make a difference to how they interpret Socrates' answer to the question, what is episteme? Rather, its main difference is in how they interpret the way that Socrates' answer to that question structures his epistemology more broadly. One last point about this general approach to epistemology. Proponents differ on whether the paradigm or ideal must be, at least in principle, attainable by human beings. Pascal thinks that it must, while Carpenter is at least open to the possibility that it need not. Now, I think that Socrates takes the conditions he places in episteme to be in principle unattainable by actual human beings. In a sense, I think that he takes the form of episteme to be merely approximable. I think that this is a consequence of his claim, which I noted in the introduction, that it is not possible for something to be carried out exactly as described in speech. But I will not argue for this point here, nor will I assume it. Because even if one thinks that the conditions on episteme are, in principle, attainable, the key point about it being appropriate, at least in certain contexts of attribution, to attribute episteme to people in states that do not meet those conditions still holds. So in what sense, then, is episteme, as Socrates describes it, something that admits of degrees of participation? Let's begin with the most direct characterization he gives of episteme in the image of the line. This is T13 on the handout. He says, also understand, then, that by the other subsection of the intelligible, I mean what reason itself grasps by the power of dialectical discussion, treating its hypotheses not as principles, but as genuine hypotheses, that is, stepping stones and links in a chain, in order to arrive at what is unhypothetical and the principle of everything. Having grasped this principle, reason reverses itself, and keeping hold of what follows from it, comes down to a conclusion, making no use of anything perceptible at all, but only of forms themselves, moving on through forms to forms and ending in forms. So episteme, that is what episteme is a comprehensive and completely accurate grasp of, as we saw Cooper put it, the whole system of forms, having at its apex the form of the good. Shortly after T13, Socrates tells us that episteme participates in clarity to the highest degree, while the other subsections participate in clarity to lesser and lesser degrees. That is, while episteme is, I think, unqualifiedly clear, the lower subsections are mixed more and more with obscurity. Elsewhere, we learn that episteme is also most precise and most stable, while the other subsections are increasingly imprecise and increasingly unstable. So episteme is a clear, precise, and stable grasp of the whole system of forms. To be closer to or further from that grasp is to participate in the form of episteme to greater or lesser degrees. As I take T10 to entail, it is appropriate to predicate epistemôn, or having episteme of someone, if they are closest to and participate in the form of episteme far more than anyone else. But what about episteme of some particular item? That is, Socrates thinks that someone can have episteme of X. And what are the conditions on that? Socrates is, in fact, quite specific about what episteme of the form of the good requires. And this is T14. He says, whoever is unable to distinguish and account the form of the good, separating it from the others, passing all examinations as if in battle, striving to examine things not based on doxa but based on being, and journey through all that with his account not falling, you will say that he does not have episteme of, Adonai, the good itself or any other good whatsoever. The conditions under which Socrates says we will say that someone does or does not have episteme of the form of the good are conditions that people can be closer to and further from meeting. One can have developed their ability to distinguish the form of the good in account from the other forms, pass all examinations about it, and so on, to greater and lesser degrees. But these conditions also seem to require that one have the kind of grasp of the whole system of forms that, we just saw, is what episteme is. In other words, to have episteme of the form of the good, one must have episteme in general, and to have episteme in general, one must have episteme of the form of the good. This is in line with people's description of his account as he has a holistic conception of episteme. Now, to further develop this idea, I want to contrast someone who has dianoia of a mathematical item with someone who has episteme of that same mathematical item. Now, I know it is controversial to say that someone can have episteme of mathematical items. I have argued for this at length elsewhere. What I want to do is recapitulate the main points, as this will help us understand Socrates' attributions of episteme more broadly. So when Socrates first presents the line in Book 6, he tells us the mathematicians establish conclusions from hypotheses for which they do not give and do not think it necessary to give accounts. When he then returns to the line in Book 7, he makes the stronger point that it is precisely because mathematicians are unable to give accounts for their hypotheses that they do not achieve episteme, but only dianoia of the conclusions that follow from those hypotheses. And this is T15 on the handout. He says, as for the rest, which we said holds something of that which is, geometry and those following it, we saw that while they do dream about what that which is, they cannot see them while wide awake, as long as they use hypotheses that they leave undisturbed, and for which they cannot give any account. After all, when the principle is not held as a matter of episteme, and the conclusion and the steps in between are put together out of what is not held as a matter of episteme, what mechanism could possibly turn any agreement reached in such cases into episteme? So, I take the idea to be, geometers hypothesize that a point is that of which there is no part. A line is a length without breadth. A triangle is a rectilineal figure contained by three straight lines, and so on. Taking these principles as given, they can, for example, prove the Pythagorean theorem. However, they are unable to give an argument that explains why a point is that of which there is no part, why a line is a length without breadth, and so on. As a result, Socrates characterizes them as dreaming. Now, this might initially seem like odd language to characterize dianoia, but if what I have said is correct, and Socrates conceives of dianoia as approximating but falling short of episteme, and sort of being a mixture of episteme and ignorance, it makes good sense. But if mathematicians leave their principles undisturbed by failing to provide arguments for them, philosophers must disturb those principles precisely by giving arguments for them. Indeed, in the line immediately following T15, skipping over Glaucon's like verily, I forget what version it is, Socrates insists that dialectic is the only method that journeys by taking up, anairain, hypotheses to the principle itself. One thing that philosophers achieve via dialectic, then, is a grasp of the form of the good, from which they can explain why a point is that of which there is no part, and so on. Philosophers can thus give the correct explanations for the principles that mathematicians take as given. When Socrates says that someone who cannot give accounts for the principles cannot have episteme of the conclusions that follow from those principles, the implicature is that someone who can give such accounts does have episteme of those conclusions. The picture that thus emerges is that episteme of a mathematical item, such as the Pythagorean theorem, involves being able to explain it ultimately in light of the form of the good, of which one has episteme. So to sum up, episteme is a clear, precise, and stable grasp of intelligible reality. Episteme of a particular item, such as the Pythagorean theorem, is a clear, precise, and stable grasp of that item's inferential and explanatory role in intelligible reality. Thus, to have episteme of a particular item requires having episteme in general. And then the degree to which someone has episteme of a particular item is going to co-vary with the degree to which they have episteme in general. Okay, now that's the main part. So understanding Socrates as countenancing a form of episteme and as having a paradigmatist or idealized approach to episteme can help us explain what might seem like otherwise odd attributions of episteme that Socrates makes. In particular, Socrates attributes episteme of items to people who he cannot think have grasped the form of the good, and so cannot meet the conditions in episteme that we saw him posit above. Above, we saw that Socrates and Glaucon tried to identify which of the many multifarious kinds of episteme in the city makes the city wise. Before identifying the relevant episteme as the episteme of guardianship, Socrates rejects some other candidates. So this is T16 on your handout. So it is because of the episteme of the carpenters that the city deserves to be described. So is it because of the episteme of the carpenters that the city deserves to be described as wise and judicious? Glaucon, not at all. It is called skilled in carpentry because of that. Socrates. So a city shouldn't be called wise because it has the episteme that deliberates about how wooden things can be best. What about this then? What about the episteme of things made of bronze or anything else of that sort? Not anything of that sort either. And Socrates, and not the episteme of how to produce crops from the soil. In a similar vein, in Book 10, Socrates attributes episteme to the users of manufactured items, such as reins and bits, and such as flutes. This is T17 on your handout. So as regards the same manufactured item, its maker, through associating with the one who knows and having to listen to the one who knows, has correct doxa about its good and bad qualities, while its user has episteme. So the people described in T16 and T17 as having episteme of some item cannot have grasped the form of the good. Indeed, they have not embarked on much of the process that Socrates claims will ultimately terminate in grasp of the form of the good. As a result, many interpreters take Socrates to be using episteme loosely in these passages, where, despite minor variations, this means that he is not using it in line with how he characterizes episteme in the middle books. Now, I think that we should be wary of reading Socrates as using episteme loosely here. And so one reason is a reading on which Socrates isn't doing that, I think is preferable all else equal. But more importantly, Socrates suggests in T16 and T17 that part of why he attributes episteme to such people is that they have certain cognitive competencies with respect to what is better and worse in their respective domains. And Socrates would think that the form of the good is what ultimately explains what is better and worse in those domains. So we should think that episteme, even in the domains at issue in these texts, requires grasp of the form of the good. That is, we should take the discussion of episteme in the middle books to refine rather than override his discussion in these contexts. On my reading, we can understand Socrates' attributions of episteme in these passages to be grounded in the paradigm of episteme he articulates in the middle books. As we've seen, to have episteme of an item is to be able to explain it, or all the items that make it up, if it is a domain, in light of the form of the good, of which one has episteme. To have episteme of carpentry, things made of bronze, farming, or manufactured items, then, is to be able to explain them ultimately in light of the form of the good. The people whom he characterizes in T16 cannot do that, but they are closer to being able to do that than, say, someone who cannot correctly deliberate about how wooden things would be best. In T17, the user of the instrument also cannot do that, but they are being explicitly compared to its maker. In those contexts, Socrates can judge that their degree of approximation to episteme is sufficient to warrant attributing episteme to them, even if, in other contexts, without any change in their cognitive position, he would deny that they have episteme, and he can do so without equivocation. So one further idea I've been tossing around is that a uniting feature of these people is that there's some ergon that they perform. Perhaps Socrates is willing to attribute episteme to these people because the context of attribution is whether their cognitive position enables them to perform some specific ergon well. That is, because they approximate what it is to have episteme of that domain to a degree sufficient to perform that ergon well, Socrates thinks it is appropriate to attribute episteme of the domain to them in that context. Okay, so now just to conclude. I have argued that Socrates in the Republic countenance as a form of episteme. I have also argued that this should lead us to understand his approach to episteme in line with paradeigmatist or idealized approaches to epistemology. In line with these approaches, Socrates takes the philosophical task of answering the question, what is episteme, to be the task of articulating the paradigm, ideal, unqualified version of episteme. Other cognitive events are then evaluated as successes or failures depending on how closely they approximate that ideal and the qualities that it exhibits. I want to close with what I think is maybe one benefit to reading Socrates in this way, additional benefit. So at the beginning of the talk, I observed that Socrates' conditions on episteme are incredibly demanding. We have seen that the demanding nature of Socrates' conditions, what we've seen suggests that the demanding nature of Socrates' conditions should not worry us, either as a philosophical matter or as presenting problems internal to the Republic. So, you might think that given the demanding conditions he puts on it, he can't be putting conditions on the state that we should have any reason to care about. That'd be a philosophical matter. Or maybe it would undermine his political project given how demanding they are. Yes, those conditions are demanding, but that is because they are conditions on ideal episteme. That ideal can serve to regulate our cognitive lives, even if they are so demanding that they are practically, or perhaps even in principle, impossible to achieve. Indeed, Socrates thinks that we can approximate the ideal such that, in certain contexts, we can be appropriately said to have episteme. Thank you.
Um,
Well, thank you very much, Whitney, for this very interesting topic and presentation. Now I'm very looking forward for the discussion that will follow. And so let us proceed. So I see the first question is from Dukas Kapadais.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was very interesting. So I have a suggestion that I am not prima facie sure if it's in favor or against your general interpretation. So I find very plausible to relate the good and episteme in several ways, and in a certain sense, uh, they are akin to one another because both of them are kinds of higher order forms, if forms at all. What I mean is this, that one might consider that we have a ground level where participation in is put to work, like why Helen is beautiful, because she participates in the idea of beauty. And then higher level where participation itself is used in order to define the object which has a property. Well, in this instance, epistemon. So the epistemon is regarding Helen is one who knows that Helen participates in the idea of beauty. And when in some more complicated ways, also the geometer is one who knows the forms that a triangle participates in and thereby knows the Pythagorean theorem. And also, just to close, uh, our first reflex would be also the sophist, where the epistemon par excellence, which is the dialectician, is one who knows which form participates in which and which does not. So I don't know if it is in favor but or against of your approach, but it puts good and episteme in some kind of similar level. It's meta levels kind of ideas or activity. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have to think about. That's helpful. Uh, yeah, picking out just some elements of that. I'm a little hesitant to say that the mathematician knows the Pythagorean theorem because they know the form in which, say, the three angles participates, or they know the form of the square participates. If what we mean by know is like have episteme, I think he's characterizing in the upper subsection. Because I tend to think they don't have that, and then the same idea would carry over. But maybe I misunderstand what you mean by the meta level and the first level. Like I
What
don't.
about the dialectician in the sophist? Is one who knows, so the epistemon par excellence is the dialectician, the one who knows which things participate in which and which does not participate. So uh, a person who knows what a thing is a person who knows the forms in which the thing participates and the forms in which it does not. So he is the epistemon in the sophist.
Oh, yeah, I think that is in line. I'm really trying to limit to the Republic, but I do think that is
Yeah.
consonant with the general picture that I want to have. I mean, I didn't the paper version will allude to other dialogues. The sophist is one that I haven't put as, but like ones where we explicitly get episteme of form of episteme. But So I'm trying to, but I do think that as you've described it, what I'm saying is quite consonant with that. Like because I mean, one way you might think it has to be is in the beginning of the book five argument, he does say that the person who is I think awake, it's not just they see the forms, they see the participants, and they don't confuse the one for the other, which seems to be in line with what you're saying is required in the sophist. And I think I hope that everything I've said is consistent with thinking that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Hermione Prokopaki.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. So, my question is the following. So I took it that you argued for episteme being a form for the sake of drawing these E1 through 3 conclusions on the basis of the parallel to justice, right? That's kind of what you want to defend. So, I mean, that's the first. So if that's right, then it seems to me that E1 and E3 can be defended in other ways also. And it's really only E2 that depends on the claim that episteme is a form, because you say that being an epistemon is a matter of participating in the form of episteme. So I take it that that's really kind of the conclusion you're sort of drawing. But then I wonder about that, because now I wonder, what about knowing justice, because I wonder about how I'm supposed to understand knowing justice, for example, or beauty or whatever other form, and how the explanation that I participate in episteme on the one hand relates in some way with, me as the philosopher king being like justice or something, and my soul being a copy of justice, for example, which are things he says. Because now these seem, if not competing explanations, then one of them is at least redundant in some way, and it would seem that I participate in episteme is the redundant one. So that's what I'm wondering about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so the first part, well, it's true. It's certainly true that some of those that the list can be argued for in other ways. I what I was the way I was thinking is it's more at a general level that refining ourselves to the public, if Socrates counted as a form of episteme, then how his, like, put it vaguely, theoretical stance to episteme and everything we should attribute it is analogous or parallel to his theoretical stance to justice. So in this passage where we get a bunch of claims about how he's conceiving of his theoretical stance to justice apply to episteme. And so that's what my main aim was. It wasn't, I wouldn't put it to establish J2, but in a sense for a lot of the consequences I draw, it is J2 that's doing a lot of the work. Does that help a little bit?
Well, yes, but I mean thank you, but the other question kind of still stands, because you're still defending those observations ultimately.
So I guess I maybe I didn't quite follow, but I would say so if you're asking, like, what is it to know to have episteme of the form of beauty or the form of justice? It's to meet that condition that he lays out in the upper subject line. It's like what it is. You participate in actual concrete count. It's appropriate to attribute episteme of that to you to the degree that you approximate in episteme of beauty, which requires having episteme generally speaking. So I don't so you participate in justice in virtue of, to the degree that your soul is ordered in the way that he says it needs to be in books 2 to 4. You participate in beauty, such as well, he doesn't tell us here, but we get elsewhere, and you participate in and you count, and so it's appropriate to predicate just or beautiful view, depending on how you approximate those things. Now, of course, he does think like, you know, at least some of these things like just and the other virtues seem to come as a package deal. Like if wisdom is episteme, the degree to which you approximate episteme will covary with the degree you approximate justice, and so on. But the strict claim is the degree to which the sort of you participate in the form of episteme, which then can be said is you and uh, and it's like it's that degree of participation that determines which context it's appropriate to attribute episteme to you or epistemon to you. I guess maybe I missed why it's where's the problem supposed to arise? Maybe I just misunderstood.
So it's not clear to me what is gained by saying that one participates in episteme that we don't already have by being told a story about what it is to know justice, for example, or anything else. But I guess I take your point that you're saying that he is committed to saying that episteme is a form. And if that's the case, then we do have to sort of acknowledge that and draw implications from this. So,
Yeah.
which, that might be. But if that's not true, then I still think it's redundant to say that we participate in episteme. So that's kind of my point ultimately. So
I guess that's what I meant. Why would it be? Where's the redundancy?
because sorry.
Right, I would have thought in one way, there's a sense in which couldn't, if he tells us what it is, books 2 to 4 tell us what it's to be just, is it then redundant to say there's a form of justice and we participate in it, and it's a virtual participating that we count as just in the way that we do? Like, it just seems to be analogous. Is there a special problem with episteme? Like, is there something unique to episteme in this case as opposed to all the other forms? That would be.
So I mean, I don't want to draw this out, but I would respond to this that somehow in the middle books, a lot changes once the philosopher king is there. So a lot of things have to be sort of revised. But I mean, I don't have the account, but I take your point. Yeah.
One last thing I want to say in response. So I took this out of the talk version just for time, but so I kind of intentionally didn't pitch the argument as arguing that episteme is a form. Because I think that would be misleading as to what I'm trying to say. It's that Socrates' countenance is a form of episteme. And I think in a parallel way, it would be kind of misleading to say that justice is a form, because then that might filter like how you're understanding everything he says about justice, involving justice. He counts as a form of episteme. And recognize that he does so should structure how we influence how we understand his discussion of justice. It's analogous in the case of episteme. I'm not sure if that was a word you had. I just want to kind of get that on the table because I put it that way. It's not episteme is a form. It strikes me as a slightly misleading way of putting the point I'm trying to make.
Well, I wasn't thinking that, but that is also helpful. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Hermione. Next question from Ben Morrison.
Hi, thank you, Whitney. I hope you can hear me okay. Can we go back to T15 on page 4 of the handout? Because I think I'm a little unsure about how you are using it and also about how you understand it. So is this right that you're using it because you want to show that there can be cases of falling short of episteme, but that this can be upgraded or something like that? Or can you say how you're using it? And then can you say a bit more about how you understand actually the Greek of T15? Because the word they that comes up several times in the first sentence of T15, that's talking about the techni, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of a somewhat strange idea. So can you just sort of flesh out a bit more what you want to say about T15?
Oh, so yeah, but it is. So what I'm using that for is um I'm going to go on to look at these bits where it seems to me like he's attributing episteme of some item that's, say, pretty far removed, even more, it seems even more far removed from the upper subsection of the highest subsection of the divided line. So it's a model in which you can have episteme. If I can explain the sense in which you can have what it is to have episteme of the Pythagorean theorem, then we get a kind of picture of I thought it was naturally like, so then when we look at these other passages, we should expect if he's going to episteme it, and if he's meaning it in the same way that he talks about it in books 5 to 7, it should involve that same sort of needing to trace something back up to the form of the good. So the actual Greek, so um
I mean, to my eye, it looks like it's saying about the techne of geometry itself
yeah.
that um, it dreams and that it can only grasp part of being, and that's sort of what you'd expect, isn't it? Because um, geometrical objects, for all their wonderfulness, are still not, I guess, full examples of being because they are multiple and not single, and to be a pure being or whatever for Plato seems to be in the Republic seems to be something to do with being one. So uh, I thought that the fact he was talking here about the techne itself as falling short strongly suggested that um, as long as you're doing that techne, you're not going to be thinking about things, and you're not going to be thinking about pure beings in the right way. Rather than suggesting that there's some way in which you could be thinking about those things and be having episteme, which I think
No,
is
oh
the way
no.
you're wanting to go with
No,
it.
no,
Maybe
no,
not.
no. I agree exactly with what you said. That's what he's thinking. It's then in the next line when I take the then he says, so dialectics, the only thing that could take those principles up to the form of the good. Right. So I do think I think he's describing these techni and how mathematicians, like as he had also characterized in book 6, they're the ones who are dreaming. But when he then it says in the next line, dialectics, the only thing that can take up the first those archai to the genuine unhypothetical archai. Um, I take the implicature to be, and thus achieve episteme of the very same things that here he's saying doesn't count as episteme of those things. That's how I'm understanding. I'm not understand. I don't take T15 on its own to involve a commitment to the claim that there can be episteme of, say, the Pythagorean theorem. It's an implicature of saying they don't take those people don't. They can't give the logoi of their archai. Dialecticians can. So then when we think about, okay, so now a dialectician is like doing mathematics, they sort of like, it might not change for them below the level of point is that of which there is no part. Like the content of their state might the same, but they can give the deeper explanation for why those principles actually are the case. And that's what makes it the case that they have episteme of them.
Of
So it's
them
not
being of them, well, you
the
say they then,
mathematical items, Pythagorean theorem, and what have you.
but that doesn't seem to follow quite from the way you've put it. It looks like what would give them is episteme of the archai.
Well, so no, I mean, look at the end of it because he's like, if the archive, yeah, right, and then so if the archive is not episteme and the intermediates aren't episteme, what could convert these agreements? I take it to be the conclusions into episteme. So it converts it all the way down to episteme.
I'm not. That seems to me possible, but also it's possible to think of the agreements as being something like the things agreed upon, and the things agreed upon in the context of a science are normally thought to be the principles.
Oh no, so then go back. I mean, I think going back to the book six language, what's there is what they agree on the things they set out. It's the conclusions.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just say one more time then. So I see where you're going with that, but just say one more time how that fits into the dialectic of the paper.
So then we go look at, say, what would episteme of carpentry require? Well, we've just seen what episteme, like something might initially strike people as odd to say that there could be episteme of, or a person could have episteme of that thing. Well, it's going to fit the same model that we just saw with what it would take to have episteme of the items that other people have only dianoia of, right? Taking it all the way back up to the form of the good. Maybe that's unnecessary. Maybe everyone would just agree that if it's going to be genuine episteme of carpentry and whatnot, it has to ultimately be explained in light of the form of the good. Maybe if you agree with that, then the idea is this is maybe an unnecessary detour.
Thanks.
That was the idea,
Right.
right?
Thanks.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So next one is Gail Fine.
Thank you. Thanks, Whitney. I
Yeah.
had a question about, I guess your section 2.4 on episteme is a power.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, 2.3 and 2.4. So in 2.3, the passage from Republic 6, were you translate the power gives the power to the one with gnosis. Were you taking power there to be a form?
Yeah. So
Because what I was going to say was like in 2.4, when he talks about dunamis and your T8 and 9, I was taking those were capacities or abilities or something that people have in virtue of participating in the form, but the form itself isn't said to be a power. It's not actually even explicitly relevant in the Republic 4 passages. Obviously, forms come into the Republic 6 passage, but I didn't think dunamis there referred to the form of episteme, rather the form of the good enables one, gives one certain power. If you grasp it, it gives you the power to know or actual knowledge. There's dispute about whether power there equal. I mean, like Adam argues that power is used where Aristotle would use actuality. Other people think it means capacity or something. There's dispute about that, but to say it is a form, that the form of justice is itself a dunamis, sounds weird.
Yeah, so good. So I take TA. Part of the reason why I find TA, I think he's both illuminating the epistemological role that the form of the good plays when it comes to actual thinkers, and then the metaphysical role that the form of episteme plays in the intelligible realm. And the first part is about the first, and the second, and then the transition goes to the truth of beautiful beings, right? So because he says the power to the one with gnosis. So it's slightly different from saying that he's talking about the power of gnosis, but the power to the one with gnosis. So I take the first part.
Many people insert in brackets there the power to know, which
but
seems to be what he means, though you're right, the Greek doesn't actually contain those words there.
Yeah, and that's why I actually think that it's in the paper version I go into more detail where I think the first part this bit is trying to illuminate both the epistemological role it plays and then also roughly its I guess I'll say its metaphysical position in the intelligible realm. Does that help how I'm understanding it?
I agree that the passage has both metaphysical and epistemological points to make, but I don't see that one of the points that's being made is that the form itself, if you want to say episteme is what's at issue there, is said to be a dunamis.
No, I don't. Oh, sorry. I'm not saying. Oh, no, not here. No.
Well, the section 2.4 says episteme is a power. Was that the form of episteme that's a dunamis, a power?
Oh, sorry. I should have I should have just been way more careful. I've gotten the objection, but he says episteme is a dunamis, right? Not only does he not say it's a form explicitly, he says it's a dunamis.
That what's a dunamis? You said is a dunamis.
He characterizes episteme as a dunamis in some places in the Republic. That's sort of the most
Yeah,
careful.
but it's not clear that it's the form of episteme that's being characterized as a dunamis. As
No, I agree.
A person
I
who's
agree.
not, yeah.
I agree entirely.
Okay.
I'm not trying to claim that in T8 that he's characterizing in T8 or 9 that the dunamis of that is courage as a form, or the dunamis that is justice as a form, nor in those 5 passages is he characterizing the dunamis that is episteme or doxa as a form. I do think, and this is so there's something in line with Adam and with other people where, so using sort of looking at episteme as he's characterizing it as a dunamis in book 5, and justice and courage as he's characterizing it as dunamis in book 4. I think they might be slightly different, and I'm not sure whether Plato, but like using anachronistic Aristotelian distinctions, it might be that the relevant kind of dunamis is what in book 5 that episteme, as he's understanding episteme, is it's what Aristotle would call a first potentiality that can be brought to a state of first actuality, and maybe courage and justice or what Aristotle would call a second actuality, right? Already having it, but even there, but that's a complication that I don't want to get into. I don't think I need to. So I wasn't claiming that there he's saying, what I was trying to say is he both will characterize something as a power. He both will characterize justice as a power, and he thinks there's a form of justice.
Yeah, but they aren't the same thing.
But they aren't the same thing, right?
Yeah.
That's why I said more work needs to be done about the connection between the episteme, that is the power of episteme, and the form of episteme. And I think something like to the exercise of that power, we come to participate in the form is a very rough way of doing it. I mean, I was very hand wavy there. I was very just programmatic, right? I said like more would need to be said about the connection of that. I don't take them to be talking about the same thing.
Okay, and this is just a small comment. I should just send you a note rather than wasting time here, but I suppose the main place where Plato is sometimes explicitly thought to have a form of episteme is the greatest difficulty argument in the Parmenides. But I don't know that passage is especially helpful to your concerns with the Republic.
Well, I hope it is, because it was actually the last thing I cut before the presentation for purposes of time. So
okay.
One reason, and so maybe we should talk about this, but it also maybe, because it's where we get the most explicit. There's a form of episteme and a form of truth, and I think cross dialogue corroboration is difficult, but if you're inclined like me to read Plato as wanting us to think that the character young Socrates is presenting a view that Socrates in the Republic and Socrates elsewhere has, then when he says like, okay, well, is there a form of just good in that? Of course. Is there a form of human being, fire, water? Yeah, I don't know, mud, dirt, hair? No, although the same problem has occurred to me on many occasions. Then when he goes on in the Megiston, after the greatest difficulty, Parmenides just talks about the form of episteme, the form of truth, and he says each particular, and he talks about each particular episteme would be episteme of a particular being. Socrates accepts all that. I think there's a way of reading where Plato's signaling to us that he wants us to think that Socrates in the Republic had that view. And then I went to the tripartition argument where in trying to get Glaucon to understand what he means when he says thirst itself is for drink itself, and not like a hot drink, good drink, whatever. He says episteme itself would be it's what can be learned mathematos out to, or whatever we should say the episteme would be. And a particular episteme is episteme of a particular thing. And then what I said is rhetorically, like, I'm not saying in book 4 Socrates is committing himself to there being a form of episteme and a form of truth. But I am saying he's saying exactly what someone who did think that would say, like Parmenides and young Socrates.
Yeah, I mean the Republic 4 thing can just mean thirst in general or as such.
Of course.
It doesn't have that metaphor, and similarly for episteme.
Of course, and that's why the idea is, but I'm like, it's something someone who did think that would say, even if that's not what he's saying, like even if he doesn't, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Vasilis Karasmanis.
Yeah, I think that this last question and point of Gail Fine is the most serious to your paper, and I will continue to that. Plato never says that episteme is a form, as you say also, you said. But in Book 5, in the passage 477 CD, that it's not in your handout, he says that it is dynamis, is a power. And he parallelizes with the power of, or the capacity of vision and so on. So if we stick to this passage, capacities, these powers, are powers that we have, we humans have, or even animals, the power of seeing, of hearing, and so on.
Yep.
They are not independent objects out of us like the forms of the Phaedo, for example, or even in the Republic. So in this way, we cannot say that there is a form of episteme.
Yeah, I did.
You have two passages about episteme as a power, the T8 and T9 in handout from the book 4, but you cannot compare, you cannot say if this description of power of dynamis is the same with the book 5. They have the same meaning, the dynamis here and the dynamis there. I think that in a sense there are, but also I find the translation in passage 9, T9, wrong, because as it is the passage in the second line, that what remains in the city is the power that makes it possible, and so on. And this is the remaining, is the justice. We remove the three other virtues, and the remaining virtue is justice. But the text does not say is the power, say that this remaining part provides the power probably to the city to be so and so, to be just and so on, these things. So this translation is wrong. And if out of this translation we find the meaning of justice or the other virtues as powers, is totally wrong here.
I mean, that's fine. Yeah. So the full elaboration of the idea that the virtues are powers is a much broader project, and I'm convinced by people like Merrick Anderson, who had a recent paper where he makes this argument. But
yes, also that if say that virtues are powers, or say something else. If virtues are powers, so one virtue, the virtue that is proper for the philosopher's kings, is phronesis or wisdom. Okay? This is the proper from this part of soul and from this class in the city, the very upper class. It is not episteme. It does not say that the characterized the power, the virtue of the philosopher kings is episteme. He says phronesis or wisdom. This is the virtue. So in this sense, you do think that this phronesis and wisdom is the same with episteme, or episteme is something different. Episteme is the power, and the form is the wisdom or the phronesis.
no. Well, yeah, there's a
You
lot.
understand the difference? According to your interpretation, we should expect to say episteme for the fourth virtue.
Well, so some of this is I used the word episteme in part because I wanted just to avoid using the English word knowledge. I mean, I just gave a hat tip to the head fit, like a head. What do you call it? I sort of acknowledged this at the very introduction. I said his preferred term seems to be episteme for this thing he's characterizing. The question, but I think he uses other terms to pick out that state, including Sophia and phronesis. And what the idea is, he takes himself to be, yeah, I don't want to say like what he promises is a form of episteme. So like the one, if you have a like understanding of, like book 10, one over many, if you have like a metasemantic argument, that wouldn't really apply in a certain way. But the idea is if you're somebody who thinks that virtue, that kind of fourth virtue, you got justice, temperance, courage, and the fourth virtue is Sophia or wisdom. So it's Sophia or phronesis. And you think what that is episteme as he's characterizing it there. Then what he's characterizing there is that form, that form of that virtue form. And that's fine for me. I'm happy with putting it that way too. Like that's why episteme, it's maybe I should have used the word knowledge for that very reason, but that's why I use episteme.
Okay, thank you. So next question from Alexander Nehamas.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Whitney, I confess I am less puzzled by your view than I was before I heard you, which is always a good thing.
I mean, I will take that as a win for sure.
Well, it's a very good thing. I just wanted to think a little bit about what is it for participation to come in degrees? What kind of relationship is it that establishes that one participates in a higher degree than another? Take a more common example. Phaedo is taller than Socrates. What that Plato gives us as an analysis is Phaedo participates in tallness in relation to Socrates, right? Not it's in other words, what makes him taller is an aspect that he has, right?
Yeah.
That makes him that way.
Yeah.
So does the philosopher participate in episteme more than the carpenter for this kind of reason or for some other kind of reason? Because if it is just the aspectual, then I think it'll be difficult somehow to say that the philosopher has wisdom regarding carpentry. He may have wisdom or whatever about the place in carpentry in the city, the reasons why you need carpenters, but he is no carpenter. So he doesn't have the episteme that the carpenter or the flute maker has. So we could say that the philosopher participates in ignorance in relation to the carpenter. Is that something that Plato would want to say?
So this is where kind of I mean, I was saying one way to understand what it is, say, to participate in the form of episteme to a greater and greater degree is to look at those conditions in T14 to develop, and that's to develop your ability more and more and more and more, to be able to persist through more and more and more elenche, like to be able to pass more and more and more and more examinations. And I guess in some sense, that's like, would that be analogous enough to the kind of Socrates taller case?
That's what I'm asking. It seems to me there are two ways of thinking about it. One is that the higher the objects of episteme are, the more you participate in episteme.
Oh.
And the other is, if you participate in episteme, you know something that the other person doesn't.
Well, yeah. So the first part I don't know. I'd have to think about that. But when it comes to say the carpenter, my idea is something like, distinguish what's in the carpenter's head from the way the carpenter brings what's in their head into moving their hands around to make wood. I don't think Plato thinks necessarily that a philosopher would be able to bring what's in their head down into physical reality better. He might not. But the idea is like what's in their head, even with respect to the purely cognitive competencies that the carpenter has are better. So he does know more about carpentry than he is more epistemon about carpentry than the carpenter. Now that sounds weird because that you might think that means he's a better carpenter, but I don't, that's distinguishing between bringing what's in your mind down into practice. No, but I think he does think like just looking at their cognitive stance with respect position with respect to carpentry, the philosopher is actually in a superior position.
Because he knows how carpentry fits into how it is a good thing to have and things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think he does think that the cognitive competencies of a carpenter that he's even points to are like are considerations of better and worse. And Plato does think that all that would ultimately be the explanation for why it's better to do this than that, why that's more beautiful than this, and so on, is ultimately to be explained by the forms and ultimately the form of the good.
But the philosopher doesn't know why it's better to do this particular cut rather than that particular cut, right? And you almost seem to want to distinguish, to exclude that from the episteme involved, and I'm not sure.
Well, no, I don't. I'm not sure. It depends on when you say this particular cut. If we're still at the level of universals, I do think he knows is why it's better to do. They're in a position where they're in a better cognitive position with respect to why cutting wood this particular way. When we then actually are now looking at a physical thing, like
you are making, I think that's too much of a distinction between the theoretical knowledge, so to speak, of what carpentry is and the practical ability of being able to apply that knowledge. I'm suspicious of that. And I'm also suspicious of the idea that the theoretical knowledge that you have as a philosopher about carpentry will come down to any kind of specific. I mean, the philosopher will know that it's always better to cut so that the object fulfills its goal.
Yeah.
But not how that goal is to be accomplished. And how that goal is to be accomplished is not just a matter of applying that generalized knowledge to a particular case. It takes, learning and all kinds of stuff that the philosopher lacks. So,
but what about if the philosopher were to gain the experience of carpentry, they then would be given their understanding of things would be better off than the carpenter
maybe,
does.
but if they were to get that experience, they might lose some time to learn geometry. So,
Yeah, I mean, life is short. Life is short. You can only divert your attention. Yeah, but that's the picture I am trying to. That is, yeah.
But it seems to me that Plato wouldn't say that, well, life is short, so it's a pity that the philosopher doesn't know carpentry.
No. But no, of course,
But
sorry, of
that
course not.
that
That's like us
comes
talking about the view. Yeah,
that enters into the issue that the kind of things that philosopher knows are of higher value or something like that. And therefore, the philosopher participates in knowledge more than the carpenter. Those are two different.
no, I see
don't
it.
want you.
Yeah. No, I hear
I
you.
just want you to think about those
Yeah.
two ways of thinking about degrees, and tell us more about it when you send the paper for publication in Philosophia.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And next question from Claudia Yo.
Hi, thank you so much, Whitney. I think you've thought about this, but I had a question about what other sorts of things get to count as a form. So especially from T5, is there going to be a form of like keen-sightedness? And if not, like what rules that out? And then does doxa fall under one of the different kinds of knowledge?
Good. Yeah. Well, so
Or is that a form of doxa?
Yeah, good.
Right, yeah.
So um, I'm hoping I haven't taken on any commitment that would lead to like if someone could say like, look, given what I've said, if Socrates counts as a form of episteme, then he must count all these other forms, and either I have to say like, yes, he should, or right. But because I've just focused on what I think is the most restrictive understanding, like even so Gail very helpfully in her work distinguished between narrow compresence and broad compresence. I think it's like even on the like even on what I think people agree is the narrowest, most restricted range of forms, motivation for the forms, episteme fits that. So that's the so this is where I don't think that there is I don't think he counts as a form of doxa, but I'm not 100% sure on that. So I said this and I took the passage out for reasons of time, but I said that I think what I'm suggesting is the the paradigm of episteme stands to the other states on the line, as the paradigm of justice stands to the other degenerative soul and city constitutions. And so at the end of book 4, unfortunately, I just took it with like right when he's like setting up what the discussion that he then goes on to to uh um um to not to pick up until books 8 and 9. So this is uh for 445 BC and following. He says, "Come up here then, so that you can see how many kinds, right?" And that's actually, I forget, I think it's a day there, of vice there are, the ones at any rate that are worth seeing. Next line. Well, from the vantage point, so to speak, that we have reached in our argument, it seems to me that there is one eidos, one kind of virtue, and an unlimited number of kinds of vice, a limited number of eidae of vice, four of which are worth mentioning. So it is you have the paradigm of justice, and then there's just, it sounds like infinite ways to fail to fall away from that. But among those failings away, some are worth mentioning. And then the analogy is some of the fallings away are worth mentioning. Dianoia, doxa, why am I blanking? Ecclesia, right?
Pistis. Yeah.
Pistis, right? And so it's then the same question is like, is there a form of ignorance? Like, well, that seems to be a general fall under the general. Does he acknowledge countenance negative forms? And unless there's a specific reason why what I've said about episteme would explode the forms in a dangerous way, I think it's wise for me here to just avoid that question. But that's in the fuller version. That's the picture that I'm imagining, because in this, that's why like you get, you have, I do think he thinks there's a sense in which not sense, I think he thinks democracy is more just than oligarchy, whatever the order is, and oligarchy is more just than, and so on, right? But they're starting to get increasingly further away. So dianoia is closer to episteme than doxa is. Doxa is closer to episteme, and this is that bit of the subject as the this is to that, the this is to that. That sort of like when he's talking about the line. That's how I'm understanding what he's saying there. So am I committed to saying one other question is like, so are there some cases that he would characterize as doxa, which in certain contexts of attribution he would label episteme? That's a level of detail. It might just be like, no, doxa, when you're thinking, when you're cognitively engaging with a sensible object right in front of you, maybe it's too far away from the ideal. And this might actually speak to Alexander's question a little bit, that it could ever be appropriate. No context of attribution would make warrant attributing episteme to it, or not. The idea is it opens up that possibility. Does that help?
Yes, totally. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is from Leslie Brown.
Thank you very much. My question's a rather small one, and not really contributing to this very, very interesting discussion of the relation between knowledge as a virtue, knowledge as a power, and knowledge as a form. But my doubt relates to, do you know, you've got two passages called T8 on your handout, but it's the first T8, the
sorry.
image of the sun. I'm not sure you can use this. In fact, I think you can't use this to show that here Plato's committing himself to knowledge and truth being forms, because I think your interpretation of kalon, amphoteron, onton as both of them being beautiful things, I just don't think that can be right. I think all he's saying is that both of them being beautiful, in other words, it's a genitive absolute. I don't think the onton tells us that they're forms, just that both of them are beautiful. So in my view, that passage doesn't have any probative value. Of course, it's interesting that it relates knowledge and truth. And if on your interpretation, he's here saying that knowledge and truth are both forms, then, as you say, it would be similar to the passage in the Parmenides. But for myself, I don't think he can be interpreted as saying that here. But it's just a small point.
No, I think that's very well taken, and I didn't voice as much hesitancy about what I say about this passage in the talk because I just try to present it, but I am. But so one thing I guess is how. So even if I translated it as you suggest, I still think there's some reason to read it when he's like, it would be wrong to think of epistêmê and truth as good like. And he's like, there. Well, where? Or here. I mean, it's entaltho. Where? And I think in that side that he set up from the very beginning. And so then the idea is like, well, if we remember, he's been asked, so what is the form of the good? Is it knowledge? Is it pleasure? Is it something else? He's like, no, it's wrong. Like, it's wrong to think of epistêmê as the good, but it's good like, and the good is beyond it. That still does sound to me like he's saying there's a form of epistêmê, a form of truth. You could mistakenly identify them with the form of the good, but that's a mistake. It's the form of the good's even more, beautiful than them. So there, do you feel at least a little like, oh, well, I did in the talk put emphasis on the on-tone, which I think you're right, was a mistake. But even just focusing on that last half or whatever, last bit, does that not sound
well? I agree. It doesn't
indefensible.
It doesn't rule out them being forms.
Well,
it doesn't say they are forms. That was the only point I was making. And I mean, they're analogous somehow or other to light and sight. Now, nobody would think that light and sight are the sun.
No.
So you might say that by drawing the analogy with light and sight, is as it were distancing them from being the good. Whether he's distancing them from being forms is another matter. But my point was just a tiny one, that you can't rely on tone.
Yeah, that's fair, and I think that's fair. And like doesn't rule it out. I need more than that, because very few of the sentences, like the first 3 books, every sentence doesn't rule out there being a form of epistêmê. So this needs to be stronger than that for it to be worthwhile. But and bringing because there are strong parallels between the Parmenides passage that I talked about in response to Gail and this. There's some disanalogies, but it does seem there are strong resonances. Thank you. Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next question from Amber Carpenter.
Yeah.
Sorry, let's try again. Thank you, Whitney. I really enjoyed this. So I might just pick up a very small thing, because one of the tiny questions I was going to ask was about this passage, and I just think that Leslie has a point here about how you can use this passage and what you can get out of it, and in what way are we supposed to think that it's good like? The analogy doesn't help us much, but maybe reflecting in that way would be a way to look for some way that this passage could work for you. My comment kind of became a question. I don't know if you saw that I raised my hand and then lowered it and raised it again. So you had said at the beginning of your talk that you'd be interested. So, of course, obviously, I'm sympathetic, so I'm
I mean, if you're
interested
not,
to
then
see
I'm
what you're doing. But and I think there's, a completely different line of argument that could go looking at the sort of textual parallels between this part of the Republic and the Philebus,
Yep.
the epistemological passage of the
Yeah.
Philebus.
And you do a lot of good work on that.
Totally
in
different
your
kind
paper.
of.
Yeah.
But you had asked at the beginning of your talk about, might there be other advantages of looking at it this way? And I think one advantage might be, and I'm not sure that it's an advantage that couldn't accrue without the claim that it's a form, but something that does sort of come up naturally and easily from thinking that knowledge as a form is that it matters a lot more, or it's a lot more obvious how and why it matters, exactly how knowledge is described. All the specific and rich language that's used to describe knowledge becomes useful in the way that the form of justice is useful. We can then look to it to determine whether any change is an improvement or not. Any change in our cognition, our cognitive state, is an improvement or not? Well, does it have more of these features? And you've got a wide wide array of various features that you can sort of draw on to in order to make that evaluation about whether some change in a cognitive state is an improvement. Also, what should we be doing with our various cognitions of various sorts? We should be making them more like that in a very highly detailed, highly textured way. And it became kind of a question when I saw your responses to both Ben and to Alexander, that what this allows you to do is to say that all of cognitive success is not vested in the in the object, in the quality of the object. So you can grant that, and this is, I think, maybe where Alexander's question was coming from, you can grant that there's that having being as the object is a requirement, and that's one way in which something can fail to be knowledge, whether it has the right kind of thing in view. But then there's another dimension along which it can fail to be knowledge, and that's according to the quality of the cognitions and their relations and so on. And so the mathematicians fail not because they have a lesser being in view, but because they're not as clear and as cogent, they can't defend an account and all that kind of good stuff. Whereas the carpenters fail, the practicing carpenters fail, because they might have really good accounts of what they're doing and their practice, and the grain has to look like this, but they've got the wrong object in view.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So that's just a kind of suggestion for
So one just thing on that last,
keeping that in mind would help.
So I think it would still be that, and so now sorry, thank you. And Alexander, I think I didn't quite follow you, but I think it's more okay. I'll have to think about this a lot, but part of it is I think, because this is more in line with what you say about paradigmatism in the Philebus, is that those the stuff in T15 and 16 or 16 and 17 are kind of what the very lowest rank order of the rankings, right? And just make the context sensitive attributing, calling them epistêmê, wouldn't actually require this idea that the philosophers would be able to best do. It's just they are doing things which can ultimately be evaluated because they're engaged in a kind of practice, sort of the best version of which would be grasping the form of the good, right? And I think I see better. Okay, so then and one thing is, so one thing I think I do see as a benefit is, but the reason why I didn't talk about it in the talk and is that there's like, where does Plato think? Put it roughly, or of course, what are the sources of normativity? Are the forms the sources of normativity, right? Are the forms, like at least some of the forms, maybe not all of them, maybe like big, heavy, light, small, no, but like some of the forms are kind of like they're where demands on us come from, and it would given that he does seem to think that there are cognitive demands on us, that's best explained and most consonant with him thinking there's a form there in the offing is the idea. That's really helpful, I think.
Okay, thanks. I think, yes.
We can finish
Probably
with Ben.
with Ben, yes, the last question.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me ask a second question. So I want to go back again to the idea that there's evidence in the text for in your section 4 for there being different episteme attributions according to context.
Mhm.
And I think I'm a little unsure of the relation between what's T16 and T17 in your handout.
Yeah.
So it looks like you're thinking that in T17, knowledge about or episteme about the good and bad furniture or whatever is being attributed to the user. But in T16, knowledge about good and bad furniture is being attributed to the carpenter. Is that roughly how you're? And so it's like, well, there's one context in Republic 4 where it's kind of okay to attribute episteme to the carpenters, but right, strictly speaking, when we get more clear in Book 10, then we're not going to. And you're thinking that that's an example of the shiftiness of episteme terms, and that's sort of will be a right. Okay. So
like perhaps the permissibility is best why Socrates is okay with it is best explained by the picture I'm drawing, not quite as much like evident. Like he's not saying now that I'm comparing you to here, right? But he is, that's the idea.
No, that's helpful. So I'm just wondering about T16 then, because I think the speech in the middle of T16, there's actually a textual issue about the word bourlogianni.
Yeah.
So you've translated it as though with Heindorf's emendation as bourlogianni, agreeing with episteme. But I think it's better I mean, the manuscripts have it in the nominative.
Yeah.
And so, and in
Sorry,
the nominative,
excuse me, Ben, which line are you talking about?
I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's 428.
It's Socrates' second quote.
3.
Yeah.
428
Yes.
C3, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think what it means, if you translate the manuscript text, what it means is a city is to be called wise. That is to say, a city that deliberates how best it should be. So that's like a general, I mean, I think Claudia makes much of this. That's a general description of what it is for the city to be wise. Not because of the episteme that it has about wooden knickknacks or whatever. Right? It's quite dismissive, I think, wooden skew. But it's, I think, compatible with that he's attributing to the carpenters knowledge of how to make wooden things. And that in Book 10, we're talking about, as you have it in your quote, it's knowledge about which things are good and bad. So I think that what's going on in the Book 4 case is that he's saying that there's carpentry knowledge, i.e. knowledge of how to make wooden things in the city, but that doesn't make the city wise or whatever. And in Book 10, he's talking about a different kind of knowledge. He's talking about the knowledge, as you've translated it, about good and bad qualities. That's I can't remember what it is, kalus kai, there's something a bit odd, peri to kalus kai ponerias, test ponerias.
Yeah.
So it may be that there's actually a difference in the type of knowledge being talked about between T16 and T17 when you translate T16 properly. So I'm not sure it's going to end up being a helpful text for you after all. That's
well, okay, good. I'll have to think about that. But I would think because the more different things we find this working in, I like it the better.
But not if T16 attributes to carpenters knowledge of how to make wooden things, and T17 is attributing the knowledge of which things are good, which wooden things are good, to the user rather than to the carpenter. Because then you don't get an example of one and the same type of episteme being attributed in one context to one group and then in another context to another group.
Sorry, yeah, then the dialect, I just didn't make it clear. I wasn't I wasn't taking the people in T16 to be in the same cognitive position with respect to people at 17. And here he says one's episteme, and these are supposed to be two independent places where we see him attributing episteme to people who can't meet the conditions he's laid out and explaining them each independently as maybe being sensitive to this paradigm, like working with this paradigmatist approach. So getting clear on the translation will help. But that's why I was thinking. So even if he says they have episteme of how to make tables, right? And you can say like, well, you can go the standard route, which is say, well, he's just using episteme just differently, like he just would. And the idea was the other context where it would be appropriate is left ambiguous, was left vague, like, compared to, when we start thinking about math and dialectic, these really count as episteme? It's like, no, there we would deny it's episteme when the contrast class is philosophical understanding of the form of the good.
I'm with you. Okay, so 16 and 17 aren't to be taken together anyway. There's two different. I'm with you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. No, sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Well, thank you very much, Whitney. That was a very good way to end what, for me at least, has been an absolutely tremendous series of lectures altogether. I am very grateful to all of the people who participated by speaking to us, and also to the people who attended and contributed to the discussion. I think it's one of the first activities of the Center for the History of Greek Philosophy, for research in Greek philosophy. Center for Research in Greek Philosophy, or by Greek philosophy, that we are engaged in. We now have a series on metaphysics, on contemporary metaphysics, that is beginning next month, and altogether, I think I consider this superb series as a terrific beginning of the ability or the opportunity for the center to cooperate with its international colleagues and to bring the Greek philosophical community into great contact with the razor's edge of research on various philosophical issues. So I thank you very much, and I remind you that we will be publishing the papers in a specially dedicated volume of our annual publication entitled Philosophia. And Xanthippe and Thanassis are going to be in touch to discuss the various deadlines and cases like that. So once again, thank you very much, and I hope to see each and every one of you in some context or other in the near future. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you all. Thanks. Thank you all. That was really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Whitney. I will be in touch with all of you.
Great. Thank you.
The trouble begins, yes.
Yeah.
Leslie was one of my tutors on the B-Phil 20 some odd years ago.
Very good.
All right, bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.